Welcome to today's deep dive. I'm so glad you're joining us because today we are unpacking a really strange paradox.
Yeah, it's a frustrating one, honestly.
It really is. I mean, it's this idea that in so many schools right now, the students who desperately need mental health support the most
Right.
are exactly the ones who are the least likely to actually get it. When you look at the reality on the ground, the system essentially, filters out its most vulnerable kids.
It absolutely does.
So today we are looking at some internal strategy documents for a program called MentalSpace School. We're going to figure out exactly how they plan to dismantle this paradox and what a massive looming July 2026 legal deadline in Georgia has to do with, well, making it a reality.
Yeah, and to really understand that paradox, you have to realize that the current system operates like an incredibly unfair obstacle course.
An obstacle course.
Exactly. The hurdles actually get progressively higher and just much harder to clear the more vulnerable the student is. So if we break down the reality on the ground, I mean, before a student ever even sits on a therapist's couch, they have to navigate this compounding series of roadblocks. And the first massive hurdle is purely geographical.
Geographical. Okay, so think about like a student in a rural district, right? The nearest adolescent psychiatric specialist might be a 2 or 3 hour drive away.
Oh, easily.
And if you're a teenager who can't drive and your parents are, working hourly shifts and they can't simply take a Tuesday off to drive 6 hours round trip,
Yeah, they just can't do it.
that's the end of the line.
Right.
Like you receive zero care. The physical geography alone dictates your mental health.
Which is exactly where telehealth enters the picture.
Yeah.
You completely eliminate that physical geography problem by putting the therapist on a secure screen right inside the school building itself.
So they just walk down the hall?
Right. The student walks down the hall instead of, driving across the state.
Yeah.
And here's the catch. Clearing that geographical hurdle just drops you right in front of the financial one.
Of course. Because even if the therapist is technically accessible through like an iPad in the nurse's office, the psychological friction for a low-income family is just immense.
Therapy is notoriously expensive out of pocket.
Right. I mean, imagine sitting at the kitchen table looking at the family budget and feeling that paralyzing hesitation of, if I sign this consent form for my kid to talk to someone, am I going to get hit with a surprise $500 out-of-network bill next month?
And that fear alone stops preventative care dead in its tracks.
Totally.
That invisible friction is exactly what the financial strategy in these mental space documents targets. They're trying to basically obliterate that hesitation by casting an exceptionally wide insurance net.
Okay, how wide are we talking?
Very wide. But specifically, they lean heavily on Medicaid acceptance. By guaranteeing a $0 copay for vulnerable families, you aren't just solving a back-office billing issue.
Right, it's bigger than that.
Yeah, you are actively removing the psychological burden of financial dread from the parents. Because, a family should never have to choose between keeping the lights on and getting their child counseling.
No, of course not. But I have to push back here a little bit.
Sure.
I hear the logic there, but putting a screen in front of a teenager and removing the copay,
Yeah.
it kind of feels like putting a high-tech Band-Aid on a much deeper structural wound,
How do you mean?
Well, telehealth and sweeping insurance coverage solve the logistics of therapy, sure, but therapy is fundamentally a deeply human relationship.
Yes, it is.
So imagine you're a student of color. You log onto this portal, you look at the person on the screen, and you instantly think, this person has absolutely no idea what my daily life is actually like.
Right.
I mean, you can lead a student to a laptop, but you can't magically force them to trust the person on the other side of the screen.
And you just hit on the ultimate point of failure for so many mental health interventions.
Yeah.
It's a limitation this initiative actually explicitly recognizes in the documents.
Really? They bring that up?
They do. Removing the physical distance and the financial cost is frankly entirely useless if the trust barrier remains fully intact.
Wow, yeah.
If a student sits down and immediately feels defensive or misunderstood or judged, their emotional walls go right up. And the clinical efficacy of that session drops to absolutely zero.
So what's their answer to that?
This perfectly tees up the core clinical framework of the MentalSpace program, which they categorize as culturally competent care.
Okay, culturally competent care. I mean, usually that phrase sounds like corporate jargon, right? Like something slapped onto an HR brochure.
But here, they frame it as the absolute bedrock of the therapy. They state the goal is for a student to walk into a session and feel profoundly seen before they even say a single word.
Feel seen before they say a word. That's powerful, because think about the sheer cognitive load required when you have to explain your baseline existence to someone who doesn't share your background.
It's exhausting.
It's like speaking a second language. You can get the literal words out, sure, but the cultural shorthand, the emotional nuances, the historical context of your neighborhood.
It all gets lost in translation.
Exactly.
It gets utterly lost.
I mean, imagine being a teenager in a crisis, right? And spending the first 40 minutes of a 50-minute therapy session just trying to educate your provider.
Oh, man.
You have to explain why a specific interaction in your community was deeply traumatic, or, why your family dynamic operates the way it does. And you're doing all that rather than actually treating the trauma itself.
Which is the whole point of being there.
Exactly. That cognitive exhaustion is exactly why so many marginalized students just give up on therapy after one session. It's too much work.
So how does MentalSpace fix that?
Well, the intentional diversity mandated in this initiative's hiring practices is designed to shift that burden entirely.
So they're actively taking the weight off the kid. Precisely. It moves the burden of understanding away from the student having to explain themselves and places it squarely onto the provider to be natively fluent in that student's cultural reality.
Wow.
Because true accessibility isn't just about, unlocking the clinic door or handing a kid an iPad. It's about ensuring that the metaphorical room the student enters is warm, familiar, and inherently safe for the moment they log on.
That makes a lot of sense. But I have to ask, how does a sprawling organization actually guarantee that? Because diverse hiring is a great metric to put on a slide deck, but does a diverse staff automatically guarantee that a student feels profoundly seen?
Well, it doesn't happen by accident. And that's why the operational framing we see in these strategy documents is so critical.
What do you mean?
By positioning culturally competent care not as like an optional annual elective training module.
Right, not just a Friday afternoon seminar.
But as the core clinical strategy, they literally change the job description. The provider's ability to intuitively grasp a student's lived experience becomes the primary qualification for delivering care.
Oh, I see.
They're actively matching therapists to schools based on community reflection, which fundamentally rewires the power dynamic of the therapy session.
Okay, so a warm, culturally fluent room is a great start. But, a student doesn't live in that therapy room.
Now they go.
They spend 50 minutes there, and then they have to walk right back out into a massive, chaotic ecosystem. They go back into a stressful classroom and then back to their family.
Right.
And from what I read, this initiative expands its focus significantly beyond just the student. They're heavily targeting the educators and the parents, too. They even use the phrase, "you can't pour from an empty cup," when outlining their teacher wellness programs.
I love that quote. Because a school is a living, interconnected organism. The traditional mental health model kind of isolates the problem student, attempts to fix them in a sterile vacuum.
Like they're a broken car part or something.
Exactly. And then it drops them right back into the exact same high-stress environment that may have triggered the crisis in the first place.
Which makes no sense.
Right. So this initiative operates on the fundamental belief that to sustainably heal the student, you have to stabilize the environment surrounding them.
Because a burned-out teacher operating in a state of chronic high anxiety effectively acts as a stress amplifier in the classroom.
Absolutely.
The teacher is essentially the central nervous system of that room. If the teacher is vibrating with exhaustion and frustration, the students instantly internalize that lack of safety.
They pick up on it immediately.
It's basically an evolution of the classic airplane oxygen mask rule, right? You have to secure the emotional baseline of the adults in the room before the kids can feel secure enough to focus. Treating the teacher is indirectly treating the student.
That's a perfect way to put it. Treating the whole ecosystem functions as a powerful force multiplier.
Yeah.
So they're providing same-day access, 247 support, and dedicated therapist teams to the staff and the families. It's a preventative measure. Well, think of it this way. If a student achieves a massive breakthrough in their telehealth session, but then returns to a highly reactive, unsupported teacher or, a highly stressed home environment, that clinical progress unravels almost immediately.
It just falls apart.
Right. By offering crisis intervention and family counseling alongside the student's therapy, you are building an emotional scaffolding around the child. You stabilize the ground so their personal progress can actually take root and survive.
Okay, I love the idea of that scaffolding. But I look at the logistics of this deploying dedicated clinical teams to staff, students, and families simultaneously, and I immediately wonder about the scale.
Sounds like a lot.
It is a lot. By expanding the umbrella to literally everyone in the school community, are we diluting the actual resources meant for the vulnerable kids?
That's a very fair question.
Like, if a therapist is spending 3 hours a week counseling a stressed out vice principal, is a suicidal sophomore getting pushed onto a 3-month wait list?
So, the clinical model outlined here relies on dedicated, distinct resource pools precisely to prevent that cannibalization.
Oh, okay. So they aren't competing for the same hour.
Exactly. The staff support mechanisms run parallel to the student crisis interventions. They do not pull from the same hours. And furthermore, a massive concern when treating an entire ecosystem like this is privacy. The entire architecture is fully secure under HIPAA and FERPA.
Let's actually define those for a second, because data privacy in, say, a gossipy high school environment is absolutely paramount.
Oh, it's everything. Being fully secure under HIPAA and FERPA means the student's medical privacy and their educational records are entirely locked down by federal law.
Okay.
A principal cannot casually access a student's therapy notes to see what they talked about. A teacher's wellness counseling sessions are completely firewalled from the school administration.
So no one is snooping.
Right. The trust barrier we discussed earlier, the need for a student or a teacher to feel safe opening up, is maintained by this ironclad data privacy. The school facilitates the connection, but they do not get to spy on the treatment.
Okay, so a culturally competent, privacy-lock, holistic philosophy sounds amazing. It sounds utopian on paper.
It does.
But utopian theories often shatter the second they hit the bureaucratic, underfunded reality of a real-world school district.
Very true.
Which brings us to how this is actually rolling out on the ground in Georgia K-12 schools. Because the driving mechanism pushing these specific districts to adopt this comprehensive system isn't necessarily a sudden organic awakening of empathy among school boards, right?
Not exactly, no.
It is a strict legal mandate called HB 268, which carries a hard compliance deadline of July 2026.
Right. And, policy mandates often act as the blunt force required to overcome bureaucratic inertia.
Yep.
It's very easy for a school district to delay mental health initiatives when they're just viewed as nice to have. It is impossible to delay them when the state mandates them by a specific date.
A looming deadline changes everything.
It really does. And when you examine the hard outcomes of this pilot program in Georgia, you see exactly why the state is forcing the issue.
What kind of outcomes are we talking about? Let's list some of these insurances out first, actually, because we talked about Medicaid, but it's broader than that.
It is. So alongside Medicaid, which gives that $0 out-of-pocket cost, they're accepting BCBS, Cigna, Aetna, UHC, Humana, Peach State, CareSource, and AmeriGroup.
Wow, that is a massive net. So with all that access in Georgia, what's the actual data showing?
The documents highlight a 92% reduction in student anxiety and an 89% improvement in attendance among participating populations.
89% improvement in attendance.
Yeah, those numbers highlight a profound causal link.
Break that link down for us, because how does treating clinical anxiety directly put a kid back into a desk at 8:00 a.m.?
So, severe anxiety triggers a biological threat response. When a student's central nervous system is stuck in fight-or-flight mode, the prefrontal cortex, which is the part of the brain responsible for executive function, logic, and actually retaining information.
The learning part of the brain.
Exactly. It essentially shuts down. To a highly anxious brain, the physical space of the school feels deeply, physically unsafe.
Wow.
They literally cannot learn in that state, so they avoid the environment entirely, which leads to that chronic absenteeism.
Okay, that makes perfect sense.
By utilizing culturally competent care to drop those anxiety levels by 92%, you deactivate that biological threat response. The school becomes a safe environment again.
Right, they aren't terrified to be there.
The student stops avoiding the building, which naturally drives that massive 89% boost in attendance. You simply cannot teach a brain that feels like it is under attack.
That is fascinating. But, when you look at this looming 2026 deadline, it's sort of a carrot and stick situation.
Yeah, definitely.
The attendance and the reduced anxiety, that's the carrot. But HB 268 is a massive stick. So you have to wonder what is actually driving these district adoptions at the administrative level.
What do you mean?
Well, is a superintendent signing a massive contract with MentalSpace because they deeply believe in intentional diversity, neutralizing cognitive load, and holistic family counseling? Or are they just panicking about hitting a state legal deadline and avoiding whatever penalties come with failing to comply?
That's the big question. But systemically speaking, the initial motivation at the administrative level might be entirely irrelevant if the clinical outcomes on the ground remain identical.
Oh, that's a good point.
Right. A student sitting across from a culturally fluent therapist who fundamentally understands their daily existence. That kid does not care if the therapist was hired out of pure district altruism or sheer bureaucratic compliance panic.
No, of course not. They just know they're getting help.
Exactly. The legal mandate essentially acts as a Trojan horse. It forces the architecture into the building under the guise of legal compliance, but once the infrastructure is plugged in, the life-changing clinical work actually begins.
Oh.
The mandate is simply the vehicle delivering the much-needed empathy. And we see that too in the data, an 85% family satisfaction rate. That doesn't happen unless the care is genuine.
That's incredible. Well, let's retrace the path we took through these sources today because we covered a lot of ground.
We really did.
We started with the very real physical and financial roadblocks that have historically defined access to care. The isolation of rural geography that makes a clinic impossible to reach, and that paralyzing friction of medical bills that stop a family from even asking for help.
Right.
We saw how a sprawling telehealth network and comprehensive $0 insurance nets work together to clear those initial physical hurdles.
And from there, we examined the invisible psychological barriers. We explored how throwing a piece of technology at a systemic problem fails completely if you ignore the cognitive exhaustion of a student trying to translate their cultural existence to a stranger.
Yeah, the trust barrier.
Exactly. We broke down how intentional diversity shifts that heavy burden of understanding away from the child and onto the provider, creating a genuinely safe, native space for healing.
Then we widened the perspective to see the school as a living, breathing organism. We unpacked the reality that a student cannot sustainably heal if the central nervous system of their classroom, the teacher, is vibrating with untreated burnout.
You can't pour from an empty cup.
Exactly. We saw how supporting the educators and the families creates the necessary scaffolding for a student's progress to actually survive outside the therapy room.
And finally, we looked at the blunt force of the July 2026 legal mandate in Georgia. The data proves that dropping anxiety brings students back into the classroom, demonstrating that sometimes sweeping policy deadlines are the only effective way to force these vital holistic systems into a bureaucratic reality.
It's a highly intricate, interconnected solution to a crisis that has historically been treated with isolated, fragmented Band-Aids.
It really is.
It fundamentally rewires how we think about a school's responsibility to its community. And I want to leave you with a forward-looking thought to turn over in your mind, building on everything we have explored today.
Okay.
Think about the long-term generational impact of this specific rollout. If telehealth, zero-cost access, and deep intentional cultural competency successfully dismantle these massive barriers for K-12 students today, imagine what happens in a decade.
That's a wild thought.
Right. When these exact students graduate and enter adulthood, they are not going to tolerate the fragmented, financially paralyzing, culturally disconnected medical system of the past.
No, they won't.
They won't accept those old hurdles because they will have grown up in a system that proved those barriers were entirely artificial and could be broken. They're going to expect and, frankly, demand this exact same standard of accessible, personalized, culturally fluent care from the broader healthcare world.
They're going to change the market.
Exactly. The real question is, when this generation comes of age and demands a better system, is the adult world going to be ready for them? Thank you for coming along on this deep dive with us today. We will catch you next time.